I have to read this one off, and I also am aware of the fact that that is being recorded. So let's go. It's entitled Reflections of a Cold War Intelligence Operator, Putin, Gorbachev, and the Collapse of the USSR. We originally said Putin, Gorbachev, and Turton, but that sounded pretentious. So we took the pretentious bit out. So I'm going to start off by saying today we live in a bewildering world. Governments are losing legitimacy. Populism and nationalism are both on the ascendancy, as are anti-globalist sentiments. The democracies of the so-called free world are showing signs of distress, as the power of social media has given each a very powerful voice. The world has recently faced the threat of global economic meltdown. I don't have that in front of you. Global economic meltdown, a pandemic that rewrote the rules of free trade, and currently the Russo-Ukrainian war that has sent energy markets into shock and exposed the global vulnerability of food supply chains. In South Africa, we face all of the above, but with the added problems of a failing state, characterized by the collapse of both the energy grid and the water supply systems. Our economy is in severe distress, with unemployment at all-time highs, a net outflow of private capital and highly skilled individuals, a diminishing tax base, and an increasingly embattled and illegitimate government. As a former intelligence officer, I think about these things a lot. I'm a thinker, I think a lot. Possibly in a way that is different to most. That's what I'm going to share with you tonight. Tonight I've been asked to share some thoughts on Russia, based on my direct professional experiences in the final days of the Cold War. You see, I was a warrior deployed into literally what was the final days of the Cold War without knowing it. I was there when the Cold War ended. So I'm going to tell you that story. Let me give you some background. I was an operator in the 1980s and 1990s in what was then known as the Chief Directorate Covert Operations, a specialized unit within the National Intelligence Service that had been established as a high-impact resource to be deployed in a focused manner. In the late 1980s, a number of strategic events were playing out in the Southern African region, all of which created a risk landscape of extreme uncertainty. Examples of this are many, so I will mention but a few merely to set the scene. In December 1979, in distant Afghanistan, Leonid Brezhnev deployed the Soviet 40th Army in response to the Tsar Revolution. The mission, defined by the Brezhnev Doctrine, was to destroy the Mujahideen and install a pro-Soviet government in Kabul. I've subsequently met one of those Mujahideens, became a personal friend of mine. I helped him get his PhD in London. I helped him actually write his final PhD, one of those same Mujahid. The Russians were fully in command and chose to fight as they typically do, by strictly following doctrine. That doctrine meant establishing air superiority and then enabling ground-based armored forces to penetrate defined targets and capture designated towns and cities. However, the problem was that they failed to appreciate Afghan society is feudal, with power based on tribal loyalties, not in capital cities. In 1985, our good friends, the CIA, introduced the Stinger missile system to the Mujahideen. Before the era of the Stinger, the Mujahideen never won one set-piece battle against the Russian forces. After Stinger, they never lost one. Stinger challenged the conventional wisdom of the Soviets, and they were simply unable to respond. They eventually did the only thing they could do, retreat, while claiming some form of mission success. We know this was a farce because the USSR was resoundingly defeated in Afghanistan, exactly as the Americans were defeated in Vietnam. Neither admit defeat, but the reality we know is different. The significance of the defeat of the USSR in Afghanistan must be understood in the context of the leadership change that took place in 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. He was faced with three significant crises. Leadership always comes in time of crisis. And these three crises had major ramifications for the world in general, but South Africa in particular, and I'll mention them. The first was the introduction of Stinger systems to Afghanistan, made the protracted war technically unwinnable. So therefore a face-saving response was needed. They had to get out while saving face. That's important because it played out later on in Angola. The arms race, characterized by the Cold War, had completely drained the Soviet Union of all resources, with a legacy of radioactive pollution, a growing and existential threat that persists to this day. This I got from Gorbachev's mouth himself while I was having lunch with him on one particular occasion. That's what Gorbachev told me. The fiscus was under persistent pressure to bail out, listen to this, state-owned entities, which had become so cumbersome and inefficient over decades of central planning to the point where it was simply unable to cope anymore. Sound familiar? Gorbachev decided to adopt a radical new approach in which he de-escalated tensions, the opposite to what Putin started, de-escalated tensions, and reached out to the West. We all remember the famous Reagan speech in which he made that plea, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It was against the strategic background that we in South Africa faced a historic opportunity. With this USSR busy imploding, the war in Angola changed dramatically as the Cubans could no longer be constrained. Now this is unusual. What I'm telling you now is not what you think you're going to hear. The Cubans could no longer be constrained. Most people think of the Cubans as a proxy force for the Russians, but this is very far from the truth. On the contrary, the Cubans, by which I mean Fidel Castro and his leadership clique, his element, were deeply and profoundly suspicious of the Russians. They felt betrayed by Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they were equally angered by the Americans after the Bay of Pigs incident. The Cubans were active in Angola at the precise time when Russian power started to decline. In Angola, it was the Russians who were the moderate, restraining the Cubans for fear of escalating the Cold War into a hot conflict, reflecting what was known as the Kissinger Doctrine, designed to prevent escalation in a world awash with thermonuclear weapons. But after 1985, Russian power was in decline, as was the capacity to constrain Cuba. This is an important element to understand because it became extremely relevant in later years. In June 1987, at the very time that the Russian forces were withdrawing from Afghanistan, Gorbachev addressed the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Central to his speech was the need to reform the SOEs, which triggered two pieces of legislation, the Soviet Joint Venture Law and the Law on State Enterprises. Both of them are important. These two laws had a profound impact because they invited Western corporations into the USSR. McDonald's and all of that stuff started invading Russia. But they also enabled the oligarchs to emerge when they captured the core assets of the state-owned enterprises, the oil companies and the steel companies and all of these SOEs that had core assets of great value but massive amount of debt. They stripped the debt out and they just took the assets. Very clever. So they effectively nationalized the liability while privatizing the high-value core. Watch what's going to happen with Eskom. Watch what's going to happen with Eskom. Both of these became vital in the decades to come. Unbeknownst to him at the time, Gorbachev had initiated a series of reforms over which he no longer had any form of control. This, my friends, is where National Intelligence Service becomes relevant. In 1987 to 1988, during the big conventional battles along the Lomba River, known as Operations Modular, Hooper, Packer, Excite, and others, the Cold War ended abruptly in Africa. The SADF forces succeeded in preventing FOPLA from meeting their mission objective of capturing Jamba and neutralizing UNITA. 3,000 South African soldiers, conscripted soldiers, were up against 30,000 soldiers, 3 against 30. Force disparity of 10 to 1. If you're ever interested in getting a guest speaker, I'll bring you some of those people to talk about that time and that stuff. The highly aggressive Cuban 50th Armored Brigade was unable to go onto the offensive. Their intention was to go into Namibia and capture Namibia, but they were unable to. Its logistics line proving vulnerable to sabotage by SADF special forces such as Operation Drosny. And I've suggested that if you're interested, I'll bring you a speaker, the second in command of Operation Drosny, to tell you one of the most fascinating stories you will ever hear in your life about serious soldiering. FAPLA, along with their Cuban and Russian advisors, became holed up in an underground defensive position at Quito, Cuernavaca, unable to advance on Jamba, and almost overnight, a window of opportunity opened for South Africa. Now, the history teachers will know that the Battle of Quito, Cuernavaca today is being portrayed as a completely different thing. But this is what happened. They were holed up. They were dug in underground. They were being shelled daily by artillery, of which we have members of the artillery in our presence here. They know what artillery means when you rain down hellfire and brimstone daily, in every single hour of the day, you've got incoming shells. So they were holed up in Quito, Cuernavaca. So this window of opportunity was defined by the following, and this is important. The first thing was the penetration of the command and control line between Havana and Manong revealed the fact that Cuba wanted a face-saving way to leave Angola. Here, the analog is the Russian withdrawal from Afghanistan, where defeat was turned into victory by means of sophisticated propaganda. How do I know that happened? I was the agent handler handling that agent. I handled him face to face. Personally, I debriefed that same agent face to face. So we knew what the Cubans wanted. We knew they wanted out. We knew that the Cuban mothers were angry that their children were coming home in body bags. We knew that they wanted a face-saving way out. So that we parked that story. The second thing was, with a real prospect of Cubans leaving Angola, even though the SADF didn't know it yet, the troops were fighting in the front line, they didn't know about this stuff. South Africa was prepared to withdraw as well. So high-level strategic talks were taking place already about withdrawal. The UN Resolution 435 that was mentioned earlier on. Third point is, more importantly, South Africa was prepared to implement UN Resolution 435, which effectively meant the granting of Namibia its independence and the recognition of SWAPO as the legitimate government of the day. And that triggered a huge military operation, which you may or may not know of. That was the biggest single deployment of SADF into the field on request by the United Nations, what is called the 9-Day War, the brutal 9 Days War. If you're interested, I'll bring you veterans that were in that war as well. But the fourth point was, the USSR was no longer a factor. This provided a potential opportunity that was unlikely to repeat itself again. So the question is, was the USSR no longer a factor? Was what we were seeing, was this an irreversible thing? Was this a catastrophic collapse? Was it just a little flicker somewhere? What were we actually seeing? Were we seeing something of real significance? Could we turn this thing into a strategic advantage for South Africa? Within this milieu, National Intelligence Service had been operating. The Chief Directorate COVID Operations, of which I was then part, was directly involved in many of the successful special operations being run in the background. I mentioned this one where we penetrated the command and control line. These can be thought of as the enablers of the big event yet to come, a negotiated ending of the armed struggle. Time and space precludes me from elaborating on details of what was happening inside South Africa in 1989, but I can assure you that it was a lot. Well, within NIS, an innocuous organ had been created. It was named the Special Work Group, SWG, and I found myself seconded to it, ostensibly representing the operational interests of the Chief Directorate COVID Operations. Each subunit had a representative on the SWG, and I was the liaison officer for a unit known as K32. This was unusual because the norm at that time was strict compartmentation of all offensive operational entities and operators, strictly comparted. You didn't know who was working to your left, you didn't know their names, you knew nothing about them. And suddenly now we brought together with a rigid application of the need to know principle. If you don't need to know, not going to know. For the first time I began learning of other structures like K21, K22, K31. I'd previously been deployed in another structure known as K43, so I knew about that one. But this is another matter for a different conversation. The special work group consisted of a handful of operational members in the Chief Directorate COVID Operations, tasked collectively with developing the intelligence foundation for a big event that the public was yet unaware of: the negotiated conclusion of the armed struggle and the creation of a new constitution through a process that would come to be known as the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, CODESA. A handful of operators were the initial surveillance spearhead that would eventually give South Africa a new constitution. But I'm getting ahead of myself because there were many stumbling blocks in the way as this new landscape of risk opened up. Before I carry on, I just want to plant the seed. How many people think, would even accept as reality, that the democracy we have today, the embryo of that democracy was in National Intelligence Service 10 years before CODESA happened, in the head of a man called Dr. Neil Barnard, who I happen to serve with great dignity and great respect. The National Intelligence Service, believe it or not, brought us the democracy that we have today. That's another matter for another time. Navigating that uncharted landscape of risk was the raison d'etre of the Chief Directorate COVID Operations. It was the very reason that the unit had been established in the first place. Space and time precludes me from explaining how this was done. Safe to say that we made extensive use of highly trained operators, often deployed in small teams, capable of operating with minimal assistance in a foreign, hostile environment, independent of any embassy support. In fact, it was the anticipation of the total loss of embassy support that played a core role in the creation of this Chief Directorate COVID Operations in the first place. They were created in anticipation of total sanctions, of total loss of all diplomatic presence overseas. So we were tasked to develop structures to operate independently anywhere in the world without any embassy support. That was the core mission of the Chief Directorate. These specialists were tasked with specific questions, defined in technical terms as OEIs, outstanding elements of information. The audience needs to understand that when entering a new risk landscape, this is done with great consideration to the many ramifications of the operation. If people get the impression that these operators are hairy-chested men of action, they're not. They're very circumspect, they're very cautious. There's a saying in the business: you get old spies and you get bold spies, but you never get old, bold spies. So it's a question of great circumspection and great reflection before you get inserted. The risk-reward ratio is carefully weighed up before a suitably qualified operator is inserted into theatre, and plans are put in place to mitigate all known risks. These are identified through a process known as target analysis, which involves the definition of what is known as the essential elements of information, EEIs, needed to solve a core strategic problem. In other words, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And what is the essential elements of information? What do we need to know to solve that problem? And from what we need to know, what is it that we don't yet know? What we don't yet know is the outstanding elements. That's what you put the team in to go and find. They answer those questions. In essence, the EEIs, the essential elements of information, were a checklist of what we needed to know to derive a robust answer to a question of national strategic importance in an environment characterized by high risk and conflicting information from various sources, often of different reliability. It was the operator's task to explore the risk landscape, but to focus specifically on answering the questions defined by what it was that we need to know, but don't yet know, the OERs listed above. When you know what it is that you don't yet know, you are suddenly in a very strong position, ready to go onto the offensive with precision targeting. Today in South Africa, do we know what we don't know? Not a clue, not a clue. When you know what you need to know but don't know, that's when you're in a position of authority. In the mid-1989, the big strategic question was whether we could realistically negotiate a peaceful end to the armed struggle. Could we do it? Could we end this festering sore on South Africa's body politic that just seemed to never go anywhere? Could we do it? This was highly sensitive, with a strict need-to-know restriction placed on all personnel involved. Within the whole of NIS, maybe 20 people knew about it. That's how sensitive this thing was. One of the big OEIs was centered on the unknown factor of Russia. Stated differently, we needed to verify whether Russia still had the capacity to project power outside of its borders in the face of the disintegration of the USSR. In short, as the USSR was fraying around the edges, would Russia send tanks to Berlin or Bucharest as they had done to Prague in 1968? Would Russia interfere with Odessa? Did they have the capacity to derail or influence our internal processes? It was against this background that Jimmy Kippy here was selected for this mission. I was deployed in 1989. The second half, my good wife there will attest to the fact that I couldn't tell her where I was going, couldn't tell her how long I was going away for, I couldn't tell her what name I was using, could tell her nothing. She didn't know where I was going. I told her I'll come back next year maybe. Applying strict operational rules for personal and national security, the deep penetration operation made use of the third country principle. This means that my country of temporary residence was not the country of operational interest. So I stayed in country X. I got a visa to stay there, but I didn't operate there. I operated out of there behind the Iron Curtain. In fact, all efforts were made to avoid detection by the service in the host country, for our actions were not against their own national interest. I cannot say too much about the operational details underpinning the deployment, but I can elaborate on the following facts of relevance to the discussion we're having today. I found myself at what had been the point of Cold War contestation for virtually my entire life. The Berlin Wall. From when I was a small boy, I heard about the Berlin Wall. And here I found myself at the Berlin Wall. During the latter part of 1989, quite by chance, not knowing what's going on around, but knowing that something's happening. It was there that I confronted the stark difference between reality and illusion. An important theme I'm going to elaborate on now. The illusion had been deftly portrayed that the USSR was so strong that the Iron Curtain was impregnable. The illusion was a powerful one, underpinned by sophisticated propaganda, showing the fate of those who had tried to escape to the West. The first time that I saw the wall was during seething protests. Arguably the most imposing part was the Brandenburg Gate, standing like a stark reminder of the bitter combat in 1945 that left the city under rubble from door-to-door street fighting. The Russians can break stuff down. You won't believe how Russians can destroy, mostly by the Red Army, to be later divided into different sectors controlled by the Allied forces. It stood there in 1989 as a splendid reminder of the resilience of German architecture in the face of sheer destruction of Soviet artillery firepower. I found myself reflecting on the gravid presence of the many souls departed at that one place. You could almost feel the sense of these departed souls, that there was this presence. I still love Berlin to this day. There's that presence in Berlin. Now standing like a stark monument dividing the East and the West. This is where it happens. This is the line. When I first saw the Kaiser Wilhelm Church spire in Kurfürstendamm on the eastern Germany, east side, bombed out in the war, but now a monument, I could not help but be deeply moved. This is a cathedral that took hundreds of years to build. It was bombed out during Allied bombing raids. And all they'd done is they'd stabilized the spire. They'd put some structure to stop the spire from collapsing. And that stood now in Kurfürstendamm, like the sort of Champs-Élysées of Berlin, stood there as a stark reminder to the horrors of war. And I couldn't help but be absolutely moved by that. Now I've lost my space. Okay. This was the front line of the Cold War. This was where spies had been swapped for decades. And this is where the myth of Soviet might was tested in the most public way on a specific date, the 9th of November 1989, when it was announced that all border checkpoints between East Germany and West Germany would be opened, without one shot being fired. Fueled by miscommunication, the myth was debunked as the reality of Soviet power became apparent for all the world to see. I recall the sense of utter amazement as I watched ordinary people moving over what until that moment had been the hardest of all borders known in the known world. I was literally gobsmacked as I learned of one of the border guards, a guy named Harold Jaeger, who's now become quite famous subsequent to that, in command of the Bornholmer Straße checkpoint, trying to contact his superiors for orders. Communists always have to go up the line for orders. They don't make decisions themselves, always ask for orders. So he was contacting his orders. The stuff was happening around them. People were milling there and they were crossing over. And he, yeah, boss, I need orders. What do I do? What do I do? Okay, so he's trying to contact poor old Harold, trying to contact, but to no avail. It later became apparent that he knew his force was outnumbered. And he was reluctant to become the man who ordered the use of lethal force against unarmed citizens. So he ordered his staff to open the boom and allow people to pass without checking their papers. He later became a very controversial figure. He's unemployed. He's on the very margins of German society today, because some accused him of being a coward for ignoring the eventual garbled orders to allow GDR citizens out but not back in again. They were supposed to get a stamp, you can go out but never come back again. That was the decision. But he just ignored that. He went down in history as the man who let people move freely rather than open fire against them. This is the detritus of conflict and war, this kind of thing. Over that weekend, believe it or not, 2 million people crossed the border. 2 million people streamed through that border over that weekend. I was gobsmacked. I've tried to write this stuff down. You can't write this stuff down. How do you convey what you're seeing in cryptic written text? This shattered the myth of Soviet invincibility forever. In one instant, 16 million people were liberated from the persistent fear of the Stasi, the East German secret police, and a year later, even less than a year later, German unification had irretrievably altered the entire game of the Cold War. But deep within the KGB office in Dresden was a career officer named Vladimir Putin, dealing with the fallout from the collapse of the USSR, taking a cue from Romania. I haven't got time to tell you what happened in Romania, but in Romania what happened was the Securitate, the equivalent of the Stasi, was overrun, and people just got very angry and they were actually killing the Securitate officers. And I witnessed one individual putting out an angry young woman, putting out a cigarette butt in the eyes of one of these dead Securitate officers. So Putin was also monitoring what I was monitoring. So, taking a cue from Romania, when angry mob had successfully stormed a regional headquarters of the Securitate, the local equivalent of the Stasi, overthrowing the force and taking control for the first time in their lives. The date was 5th of December, 1989, and an attempt was made to storm the Stasi office in Dresden. In close proximity, almost next door to the Stasi office, was the KGB office, and confronting the angry crowd was our friend Vladimir Putin. He got out, cocky little man, got out, spoke to the people in the crowd, said, "No, if you come here, I'm going to shoot you." He warned the leaders not to storm the building, saying if they did, they would be shot. The crowd hesitated, and Putin gained control momentarily. Putin then did what all Russians do, by going up the chain of command to ask for further instructions. Remembering the Securitate incidents where officers had been killed by an angry mob, Putin needed orders. He anticipated what was coming. Great guy. He phoned KGB headquarters in Moscow, but nobody answered the call. Undeterred, Putin then phoned the commander of the Red Army tank squadron, calling for protection should the crowd return. This is precisely what we were looking for. Evidence of the Russian capacity to respond in the face of a disintegration of the satellite states comprising the USSR. Would the tanks roll in as before? Putin received the curt response that they, the tank unit, could do nothing without orders. And the 3 words came out: Moscow is silent. With those 3 words, our EEI was answered. With those 3 words, Moscow is silent. Russia had lost the capacity to project power outside of its own territory. For us, this was the moment of triumph, even as we did not yet understand the details of it, learning much of this later. Remember, out in the melee and out in the stuff going on out there, we don't know all the stuff yet. We just see what's happening. So this has all been pieced together subsequent to that. All that we knew was that the citizens had revolted, and both the Stasi and the Securitate had been overrun. But the KGB office was still intact, but probably no longer functional. That's what we knew. More importantly, Gorbachev had not authorized the deployment of tanks. And of even greater significance, he met with Chancellor Helmut Kohl in December of 1989 as the unification of Germany was cemented in treaty, thus ending the bitter division of the Cold War. Putin was later to describe the breakup of the USSR as the biggest tragedy of the 20th century. He returned to Moscow even as Gorbachev was being ousted by a military coup that brought in Boris Yeltsin, the colorful politician. I use the word colorful, colorful politician who joined the popular uprising when the tanks were shelling the Duma. They were shelling the Russian parliament. The Russian tanks were shelling the Russian Duma, and Boris, filled with a bit of vodka, all Russians drink vodka, nothing unusual about that, jumped on the tank or stood next to the tank, and he basically showed where his allegiance lay, with the tanks, and the tanks were with the people, not with the government. Important. It was this pattern that characterized the collapse of the USSR, most notably the intervention of the security forces on the side of the revolting masses against their former masters in government. Saw this in country after country. We're seeing this in South Africa today. Already we're seeing it in South Africa today. Talk about that. This is highly relevant today in contemporary South Africa as we face a growing likelihood of our own internal revolt. I returned home in about March 1990, emaciated, consumed by the rigors of operational deployment in a foreign hostile environment, but with a personal observation that there was no tangible evidence that Russia still had the capacity to project force outside of its own borders. My wife will attest to the fact that my clothes didn't fit me anymore. I'd lost probably 10, 15 kilograms in weight, and even with the tightest belt on my pants, we were just falling down around my head. The USSR had disintegrated, and the most secure hard border in the then known world had succumbed, not to the tanks and artillery, but rather to confused guards unwilling to give the order to use lethal force in the absence of clear instructions from above. The myth of Russian invincibility had been laid bare, and a young KGB officer named Vladimir Putin was busy setting himself up to be named by Boris Yeltsin as the heir apparent and the future legitimate leader of an isolated and demoralized Russia that was being overwhelmed by Western corporations and captured by billionaire oligarchs. But more importantly, we could protect Odessa, safe in the knowledge that external interference from Russia would be feeble, if not totally unlikely. I distinctly recall my return journey in an SAA jumbo jet. In those days, I was a frequent flyer. I used to do 100,000 air miles a year, maybe 200,000. And in those days, the jumbo jets had the upper deck. And you could actually, it was an economy class upper deck, because we could only fly economy class, there were rules that applied. And with a frequent flyer card, I used to always go into that upper deck, And I remember sitting that upper deck, and it was just a wonderful moment. But I felt safe for the first time in months. I felt safe. I couldn't switch off at any moment in time. In that entire deployment, I couldn't switch off. I just could not switch off. I was just hyper vigilant the whole time. And what made my return home so poignant for me, besides the sheer joy of just feeling safe once again, was the fact that sharing my flight was a large contingent of ANC, SACP exiles coming home. They were singing songs and Khaning Mal and whatever, and I was in their midst, and they didn't know who I was, and it was just wonderful. That's just how it should be. I recall the bizarre disconnect of my last image of what was then Jan Smuts Airport as I exited. I went out by Jan Smuts as my last place of safety for many months, but under the flag of the orange, white, and blue. When viewed against the new reality of now returning home, after the Cold War has come to an end, a couple of kilograms lighter, and the red flag of the South African Communist Party was flying over the airport that was then going to be renamed the Oliver Tambo International Airport. That I remember that starkly, the flag, the two flags coming in and going out. I slipped through customs with as little fuss as possible, eager only to see my family again and start the process of decompression. Time and space doesn't allow me to go into any more detail of that deployment. I will return to the present by sharing some insights that I gained as an intelligence officer who found himself deployed into what was literally the last moment of the Cold War. This was the final demise of the USSR that we were aware of in NIS. It's something we became aware of as early as 1987 and 1988, when the big battles, when the young conscripted soldiers were fighting those big battles along the Lomba River. They had no clue where this was going on. The first insight I wish to share is the absolute myth of Russian invincibility. Because you walk, talk, and look tough and you look like a gangster doesn't mean to say you really are tough. Illusion is not reality. In my professional life, I had the privilege of meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev in person. In fact, he even signed a book that I put out. He was one of the another story. I can even say that I got to know him, his wife Raiza, and a red-haired granddaughter, a lovely, vivacious young dancer. I remember her vivid red hair, whose name I cannot recall. But these were real mensha. These were real people. These were real human beings. I even got to know an advisor of his, with whom we had shared many warm moments, one in Starbucks in Kyoto, Japan of all things. I never got to meet Vladimir Putin in person, but we were both intelligence officers of similar rank, deployed into the epicenter of the eventual collapse of the USSR. We both witnessed identical events, but interpreted them through different eyes. We both experienced the tumultuous events underpinning the demise of Nicolae Ceausescu, it's another story I can tell you about, and Erich Honecker, both strongmen of the Soviet Socialist Republics. In this process, I've come to realize, exactly as we reported to NIS at the time, that Russia was and still is a mythical force. Just think about that. It had lost the capacity to project authority into the world in a way that is consistent with the international rules-based system of government enshrined in the United Nations Charter and underpinning the many legal instruments relating to sovereignty and the rule of force, way back in the 1980s already. It had only sustained that myth through the sophisticated use of propaganda and what is best described as asymmetrical warfare. It's another subject for another talk. In the digital age. Don't let bluff and bluster fool you. Don't become confused about the physical size of Russia as the largest single country on the planet, covering 11 time zones with real power. Just because you're big doesn't mean to say you're really powerful. Many large countries are in fact weak powers. It's the sheer size of the surface area that makes it impossible for a central government to project authority over the entire geographic area that we call the sovereign state. In Africa, we have excellent examples of very large countries also being the weakest in terms of projecting authority outwards. Think of the Congo, Sudan, Central African Republic, all massive and yet weak militarily and economically. Russia is no different. Russia is a third world country. The third world country, that's what they are. It's a feudal country with an economy the size of the state of Texas or Spain. Ultimately, strip it away. The economy the size of Texas or Spain. Think about what that means in terms of a capacity to sustain a protracted war. They want to take on the whole of NATO? You've got to be kidding me, guys. The economy the size of Texas or Spain, and you want to take on the combined economy of the European Union and the United States of America, that's orders of magnitude bigger than you. You've got to be kidding me, you know? What are you smoking? Hubris is not the same as empirical reality. This is the stuff of intelligence. Hubris is not the same as empirical reality. The second insight is related to the capacity of any state to convert new ideas into cutting-edge military technology, and then develop a supply chain capable of industrializing those new weapon systems. Yes, it is true that Russia has hypersonic missiles. It's also possibly true, and I'll say possibly true, that NATO forces might not have the capacity to intercept such weapons. Note that I say possibly because we don't actually know this is fact. What we do know is that the Ukrainian armed forces have not succumbed to a brutal Russian onslaught. The more they've been bombed, the stronger they've got. Exactly what happened in the Blitz in London. More importantly, we also know that the capacity to get missile launch platforms close enough to make a difference for the range of all missiles is defined by the fuel that can be carried. And hypersonic missiles are thirsty. They use masses of propellant. And this is limited simply by virtue of the depleted capacity of the Navy and Air Force. Russia has got a depleted Air Force and Navy, severely depleted. Right now, Russia, even as we speak, they've got a fleet approaching the United States of America, North Atlantic Ocean. NATO is busy tracking them. I can guarantee you serious number of submarines. I guarantee you under the waters. I guarantee it. Guarantee that every satellite on the planet is watching that fleet. I guarantee it. And they set to listen to when those doors open. When those doors open, there's a certain sound put out. Sonar picks it up. And when those doors open to launch a missile, that's when the trigger gets pulled. Not on that side, but on the NATO side. So this is watch us. Being Winghat is one thing, but actually walking, you can walk the talk, but you can talk the talk, but can you walk the walk? Russia now is unable to get its navy close enough to Ukraine to make a difference. And even as we speak, it's trying to get its fleet close enough to the continental USA to pose a legitimate threat. If it has failed in Ukraine, why should it succeed in America? Let us assume, for argument's sake, that the Russian hypersonic missiles are really a game changer. So let's argue that this is really a hell of a weapon. Let's just say it is, okay? Then we compare this with Nazi Germany, a truly industrialized nation. They were severely, heavily industrialized. In constant search for what was known as a Wunderwaffen, the wonder weapon. Every single next generation weapon was a Wunderwaffen that's going to change the war forever. That will alter the outcome forever. Did it ever happen? Was there any one Wunderwaffen that ever made a difference other than the nuclear bomb? There was no Wunderwaffen that ever made a difference. It's not Wunderwaffens that win the war. It's soldiers and blood and guts and command and control and strategy and tactic and getting people onto target and limiting casualties and taking ground. That's what wins war. Not the great big wonderful Wunderwaffen. Germany has always been way more technologically advanced than Russia will ever be. And even it was unable to find that single game-changing weapon that made a difference to the outcome of the war. I ask a logical question about how an economy the size of Texas or Spain, riddled with corruption from top to bottom, and vulnerable to sanctions aimed at critical components like semiconductors and microchips, used to control hypersonic missiles. When you're traveling 5 times the speed of sound, control surfaces are important, and you've got to make these signals very, very fast. And the G-forces are massive, and things just come apart. This is serious stuff. This is serious engineering. Will an entity like this be capable of converting new ideas into precision weapons of war in numbers big enough to make a difference? I've just heard today that this missile they were going to launch in our waters here, I've just heard today that they're not going to launch it. And I wonder why. Because I know the entire NATO is watching it. NATO wants it to be launched. They want to check it out. They want to see what happens. The more intelligence they get, the more they can counter it. Simple logic tells me that this is impossible. When that same army is unable to sustain a logistics line capable of capturing Kiev. 1 year later, they still have not got their logistics. They couldn't get rations, petrol, oil, and lubricant and ammunition to the front line on one axis. They chose 3 axes of an advance. Can you believe it? Simple logic tells me this is impossible. The third insight is related to the core weakness of any authoritarian society, where people are afraid to tell the leader what he doesn't want to hear. You as company directors know about this stuff. When you got people that we want to hear dissenting voices. We have seen this pattern repeat itself time and again. Effective military leaders always surround themselves with experts capable of giving them advice, typically from dissenting views. You want dissenting views. You encourage dissenting views. That's what pokes holes in your plan. That's what enables you to adapt and streamline and improve. That's what makes you a winner. Authoritarian leaders are intolerant of dissent and so they are seldom given information that differs from the opinion that they already hold on a given topic. Too many people are falling out of the high buildings in Russia right now. I don't know if you watch this. Too many people are suddenly falling out of high buildings or succumbing to poison, Novichok. To create a safe enough space for a senior officer to dissent by pointing out a critical flaw to the plan, in the plan of the all-powerful autocrat. Saddam, Hitler, Putin I use past tense, were all unwilling to hear dissenting voices, And so their plans remained inflexible and ultimately failed, all past tense. The fourth insight is related to the depth of resentment that the citizens of the former USSR states have towards Russia. Don't think that the USSR states love Mother Russia. Don't think it. Remember that the tanks were inserted into Prague precisely to suppress an uprising in 1968. The same thing that's happening today in Ukraine happened in Prague in 68. The same thing has happened in other countries, in other satellite countries. Why do you think this whole thing about all these former USSR countries wanting to join NATO? They want to join NATO. And this is being cited as the reason for the war, because NATO is expanding. Why? Because these people are terrified of Russia and they need protection. The feeling that ordinary citizens have towards Russia, I can assure you, is not one of warmth. They're not warm, cuddly people. They're not warm, cuddly people. I've been in the city. I've been in Moscow. Tell you they're rough. They're hard. Empathy is not a value. That they have. Okay, there we have it. Okay. I can't read anymore, so I'm going to start wrapping up. Okay. We're going to give it a minute. Okay, so. Okay, we got a bit of light, so we just carry on. I'm on the home run. Okay, so on the contrary, I would go so far as to say that Russia is feared by the citizens of the former USSR, even to the point of being hated. We must not make the mistake of believing that a leader in one of those satellite states represents the best interests of the citizens. To understand this, we must think differently about Russia as a medieval society based on strictly enforced feudal hierarchy. They are feudal society. No different to Afghan society. Very similar, in fact. Putin has forced order onto an unwilling populace, but in so doing he has empowered what used to be known as the boyars, now known as the oligarchs. They are the enforcers. These are the guys that get to feed at the trough first. They are the guys that make things happen. These are nothing more than feudal warlords. They are gangsters with Armani suits and big yachts, but they're gangsters, meting out the most primitive form of justice imaginable, and they are certainly not popular in their own sphere of interest. Which leads me to my fifth insight. The South African government, our government, I don't want to talk politics, but it gets home now. Our government has made a decision to openly side with Russia, a pariah state. In so doing, we've lost all moral high ground. Just before I came here today, I was sent by a journalist, because I do a lot of work with the media, and a journalist did an interview with me and a couple of other guys, Neil Barnard and a couple of other people a while ago, and didn't know what the thing was that he was doing, but he sent me a video before I came here, and it's the first international video that I've seen going out on the commercial circuit that is highly critical of South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa, highly critical of the whole African National Congress. It's the first time it's asking about whether the Western media got it right to suck up to the ANC as they did. So with that in mind, think about that one now. Think of that now, okay? We've lost all moral high ground in the world. All the high ground we occupied in 1994 until the recent past, the Mandela golden years. South Africa has chosen to become a member of a pariah community, and this has consequences. I'm firmly of the opinion that targeted economic sanctions are coming, both from the USA and the EU, aimed specifically at enablers and elites within the ruling ANC-SACP alliance. People with business exposure, I don't know anyone here, business exposure to any of this, take heed, you might be at risk. Start thinking about developing a circuit breaker between yourself and what might be coming down the line. We've got some bankers here, some financial people, they'll tell you when sanctions are applied, it's difficult to get out of it. Think about that. Finally, I'm going to wrap up now. Finally, we need to ask whether an embattled Putin will resort to nuclear weapons, the big question. I think the answer to this is not a simple one. If Putin was a rational actor, then he would know that any use of a nuclear weapon would immediately result in an overwhelming lethal retaliation, what's known as mutually assured destruction, MAD. If I were to make a judgment call, I would say that Putin is not a rational actor. So he might well consider the nuclear option. Might well consider it. In this regard, we need to take comfort from the billions of dollars invested into the most sophisticated intelligence operations known to mankind. Embrace a spy. They're good people. All targeting one single issue. Will Putin push the button? You've got many services, sophisticated satellites and spooks and spies and you name it, they're all looking for that one question, okay? By this I mean the entire combined intelligence services of NATO and the rest of the free world, who have penetrated the Russian chain of command at multiple levels. And I say this because if National Intelligence Service could do it to Cuba in the 1980s, our little Mickey Mouse service, if we could do it in the 1980s, then so much more can the CIA, MI6, Mossad, BND, SDECE, and a litany of other sophisticated services. These are the big boys. These are the big boys. These are the real manera. A very high probability exists that NATO governments will know before the strike is ordered. The analog here is a famous case that occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis. You probably haven't heard of it. I'm going to just mention it here. When a Russian intelligence officer known as Colonel Oleg Penkovsky defected to MI6 and provided the affirmation needed to reduce tensions by closing the gap of uncertainty. So here was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy didn't know what to do. Were they going to squeeze push the button or not? And everyone was tense, and everyone was going to pull the trigger first. And then Oleg Penkovsky came in, and he said, "I'm not going to talk to you, the American. I'll talk to a Brit." And he was handled by a guy called Greville Wynne, his handler. And Penkovsky and Wynne became famous in the intelligence, in the espionage business. They became a case study. And anyhow, the bottom line is this, that poor Penkovsky, after providing all of this incredible intelligence insight, he was eventually assassinated. That's what happens in the business. For Russia does not tolerate defectors. But the citizens of the free world owe him a huge debt of gratitude, even if the average person has never heard his name. Today, I'm convinced that many modern generation Penkovskys are being handled by NATO services. And from these high-value sources, governments will get what they need to know to protect their citizens. Not our government, we don't care about that. We care about other real governments. In conclusion, I'll wrap up now. In fact, before I wrap up, let me say, so here we've got this big exercise taking place now with this big mighty Russian Navy that's been kicked out of the Black Sea, and they're going to demonstrate their missile. So who do they choose to go to war with? South Africa, where we destroy our tanks coming over the mountain. They fall off the tank carriers. We've got one ship that is seaworthy, and I've heard today that might not make it back into dock. So that's who the mighty, powerful Russians choose to go to war with. We can't even field a fighting force. We can't sustain them for 20. Please, let's get real, guys. Okay. Right. In conclusion, I'm proud of my operational service as an intelligence officer. I look you all today fairly in the eye, squarely in the eye. I'm proud of that. In NIS, we were part of something way bigger than ourselves as individuals. I look to you as Rotarians. That's very much the Rotarian ethos. We made a difference, and we developed deep insight into complex strategic matters that impacted on the daily lives of millions of citizens. We served with integrity, and we asked for no recognition. Ab obscuro in apertum was our motto, from darkness into the light. I thank you for allowing me to to bring our story from the darkness into the light tonight. Thank you very much.
The duty falls to me to thank the speaker for tonight. When one thinks of a speaker, one thinks, what is the duties of a speaker? And a speaker is there to provide information. But a good speaker basically provides facts, provides them with a passion, with enthusiasm, and forms it into a story that everybody can identify with. And that's what we've had tonight. I'm sure you'll agree. A lot of what Anthony has said actually resonates with me. I was in the army in the 70s, in Namibia, twice. I didn't cross into Angola, but I was in logistics and we supported up into Angola. So I have a little bit of that, and some of the stories resonated with that. Also, I've been to Germany on a number of occasions, and Berlin on a number of occasions, and I've seen Checkpoint Charlie and all of those. I went there for the first time in the late 90s, and it was a wow. When you see that Checkpoint Charlie museum at that stage, which was still fresh in everybody's memory, and the wall having fallen, and now if you've gone, obviously some years later, you'll have seen the memorial to the people who died. Near the Brandenburg Gate, you see this memorial just outside it, and that in the Reichstag. So for me, this has been an amazing talk, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'd ask you to all congratulate Tony on an amazing talk, and thank you very much for sharing all of this information with us.
Thank you, Ken. I ask you all to please just think about Colonel Penkovsky. Just think about it and just pray that we've got a couple of Penkovskys out there today. Pray. We need Penkovskys are good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.